tenemos el placer de presentar a Hélia Marçal, profesora de Historia de Arte y Tecnología en la University College de Londres. Hélia ha formado parte del proyecto Reshaping the Collectible When Artworks Live in the Museum in the Tate Gallery de Londres en 2018-2020. Y es coordinadora del grupo Teoría, Historia y Ética de la Conservación del ICONCC desde 2016. Sus investigaciones se centran en la conservación de New Media Arts y Performance y la relación entre museos y patrimonio, tema del que nos hablará con la ponencia Participation and Care. Hélia, por favor.
Muchas gracias por me tener aquí. Ahora voy a mudar para lo inglés. Thank you again for having me here to present on participation and care. The organizing committee asked me specifically to address this topic, which I think they didn't know where I was going to present, so I hope I don't disappoint you. Today I'm going to talk about participation and care as a perspective, as an overarching perspective for conservation. And because I would like this to be a bit more iterative and interactive in many ways, I didn't do many notes, so I hope this goes well. We'll see. So, again, I will start by presenting a couple of artworks, and I've talked about some of these before, but some of them, it's the first time that I'll be addressing them. And there are many things that artworks have in common, even artworks that are not necessarily considered time-based media. They do exhibit some time-based media-like properties. And that is the example here of Tânia Bruguera's Destierro. This is an artwork that refers to a religious tradition from the Congo peoples of the modern Democratic Republic of the Congo. And this is a tradition called Nixie-Mikonde, which is a wooden figure that is constructed, or in the words of Tânia Bruguera, loaded or activated with mnemonic devices, whether traces, relics, body parts of a deceased individual, or metal nails, like you see here in the picture, that represent wishes that have been asked and granted, or again, to use Bruguera's words, complied with. So the Nixie-Conde tradition is based on the idea of reciprocity. If you ask Nixie-Conde, this supernatural creature, for a wish, you need to give something in return. And if a wish is granted, but the promise is not kept, the spirit of Nixie-Conde retaliates. So when Bruguera looks at Nixie-Conde to produce this artwork, she is bringing up the religious nature of this tradition with the idea of reciprocity between people and power structures. And of course, this is really important because the artist first used this amazing object as part of a performance that took place in Havana in 1998 on Fidel Castro's birthday. And with this, she wanted to echo promises that were made and not kept, asking for restitution, accountability, and justice. And you'll see that these are topics, themes that will emerge several times during this presentation. Another example of an artwork that might not look exactly like a time-based media artwork, but has these time-based media-like properties, is this artwork entitled by Ana Mendieta that right now exists as a sculpture or as what we could call a non-variable artwork. But actually, when we realize that this work has been reenacted multiple times, including by Bruguera herself, we then see that this artwork has many lives, some of them that are outside of the constraint of the museum. These are also some artworks, and these ones are some that I explored during my PhD. This is Ruptura, Rupture by Anna Hatterley, and Música Negativa, or Negative Music by Ernesto de Melo Castro. And these were two artworks that were created either during the Portuguese dictatorship, like Ernesto de Melo Castro, or right afterwards, echoing this process of recollection of the embodied memories that were created during the 48 years of dictatorship in Portugal. And what we see here is that these are performance artworks that were then recorded and have had afterlives after the performance through these mnemonic devices as well, that in this case is the moving image. In the case of Música Negativa specifically, this is a still of a video that was recorded by Anna Hatterley of Ernesto de Melo Castro producing this artwork, which had its first instantiation as a score in 1965. And this was a film, 8mm film, created in 1977, that was later digitized in 2008 and has since had many lives as well as performance, as it has been reenacted multiple times in various contexts, including in Brazil and in various locations in Portugal, either as a celebration of the event where this took place, or even as an activist action against acts of censorship. So this artwork has been appropriated and rethought in the contemporary era as well. Now, this is another example. And yes, I know I'm giving a lot of examples, but this will all make much sense afterwards when we talk about the frameworks of participation in care. This is an artwork that I've worked extensively on when I was at the Tate. This is Tony Conrad's 55 years on the infinite plane, and this is an instantiation of the artwork 10 years alive on the infinite plane that was collected in 2019 by Tate. And when I joined Tate, my first project was this one. The artwork had just been proposed for acquisition, and our question was, how can this performance be produced, and how can it be activated in the museum, especially because the last iteration of the work was in January 2017, after the artist had died. And the last example that I will be exploring today is this a couple of projects by the collective Forensic Architecture that develop forensic techniques to explore real-life events. For example, the situation of ecocide in Indonesia. And they have created an exhibition called Cloud Studies at Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester. So I will also be exploring these afterlives of the event through this forensic analysis. So when we start by looking at all these works, we then have to think, okay, what do they have in common? Besides all being some sort of time-based media artworks or time-based media iterations of artworks, one thing that they all have in common is a project that is grounded in social movements, activism, either ecofeminisms, or even activism as a form of survival. And so this is something that we will explore, and although some of them are linked with this directly, for example, Forensic Architecture is a collective that assumes itself as an interdisciplinary collective that produces art or objects that are supposed to act in the world. Some of them, like Tony Conrad, would hardly be considered activists. This is a piece of expanded cinema, experimental music. However, the way that I will address this in this presentation is thinking through these artworks to try to see how conservation can also activate artworks in the museum and how the museum itself can be a site of contestation, the development of counter-histories, and the development of caring and collective practices. So let's go for it. This is the video that introduces the Echocite in Indonesia. The Echocite in Indonesia was a project from Forensic Architecture where they showed how the release of toxic gases was creating these clouds of toxicity on the forests of Indonesia, including some wildfires that were purposely created. So we're talking about criminal set of fires in the forests of Indonesia. And the way that forensic architecture works is they look at images, and many times it's not necessarily official images. We're talking about news pieces, things that were captured on your phone and then were shared on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and all the other social media platforms that, as we could see yesterday, I have no idea about. But they share these images. Many times we're talking about moving images, and their projects always start with a question. And the question is, how did this happen? So they're talking about doing a process of investigating real-life events through images, through the moving image, through testimonies, through the gathering of evidence, and then presenting it through very careful understandings of how these, the science of clouds, for example, of airborne substances, but also very visual apparatus. So this is an example that they've called herbicide warfare in Gaza, and we see how they juxtapose images, for example, here for the environmental racism in Death Alley, Louisiana, how they juxtapose images and video with evidence and also other visual apparatus to create an idea of a collective exhibition where we are all looking at a documentary almost of how things happened. This is another example, which is the Beirut port explosion. They were able to identify the causes for the Beirut port explosion. And one of the things that I really appreciate about this collective, I have to say, is that there are many artworks that are deemed activist, or they hope to activate something in the social world, right? However, we see with this collective that their very thorough investigations had supplemented investigations by official governments, official NGOs, and also had led to restitution and retribution in the right amount. We've seen instances where governments have apologized after, for example, some investigations from forensic architecture. But again, what does this have to do with care? And before we go there, let me just say that the reason why I chose this image, it's because in conservation, we don't only think about caring for artworks and caring for those around us, like we do for our families, for example. We need to think about generations, and we're not talking about generations of 20 years in and on. We're talking about an intergenerational exchange that sometimes means that we are caring for generations that are yet to exist. And in many ways, that means that our concerns, many times, are also allied with the concerns of people who also want to take care for the planet, for the generations that are yet to exist, and want to take care for our cities, again, for the generations that are yet to exist. So this extended lifetime of the generations, how it interrelates with practices of care, means that conservation can have an aim that is indeed entangled with an aim that is social, that is environmental, and that is political. So when we talk about care, there are many ways to think about care. Some people deem it oppressive, and it can be oppressive. Some people deem it a moral duty or even a form of empathy. However, the way that I situate myself is through feminist practice and what we call the way of knowing through feminist theory, which is the epistemology. So I see care as a set of contingencies, and because we've been all so much attached to the screen lately, I actually brought this book to read the quote from, and also because we'll be here in case you want to just have a look at it, because this influenced me a lot. So the Care Collective, it's a group of professionals from various different areas, and they draw on, indeed, feminist epistemology, namely Judith Butler or John Tronto, to talk about what care is. And I'm going to quote a sentence that they have here on page 5. Care is a social capacity or activity involving the nurturing of all that is necessary for the welfare and flourishing of life. Above all, to put care center stage means recognizing and embracing our interdependence. And I think this actually is a great description of conservation, because conservation is inherently relational. We do not do conservation in a vacuum. At the very least, we do conservation related to an object. But actually, we are also doing a conservation related to all the previous generations that created effects towards that object, all the present generations that are using that object, and the future generations that might use it. So it is a relational aim, and it is a relational practice, inevitably. And so many times when we say conservation is an activity, which is, for example, something that is very much suggested in a lot of codes of ethics, it's not an activity, it is a practice. Because if it is an activity, you can do an activity by yourself, but you cannot do a practice without recognizing otherness, without recognizing the others. But what are the contingencies of care? Going back to this Tiero, care is one activity that, while it can create a protective layer, as we see here in the sculpture, it also has a lot of nails that hit you and can hit you hard. I don't know if you saw this movie. Fantastic movie. Awful movie as well. The care system, for example, can be seen as a system of oppression in the ways in which it can constrain independence, it can be paternalistic, it can also create impediments for the fruition of life or for the flourishing of life. However, if we consider the politics of interdependence at the very core of care, that means necessarily that we are not excluding independence, but we are connecting all the independent agencies together under the same aim. So my proposal is that if we put care at the center, but a form of care that it's vulnerable, that it's reciprocal, that is established on politics of intimacy and friendship, we are not going to turn ourselves into a movie villain, hopefully. History will know if we'll be villains or not, but hopefully we're not. So the idea is that when we care with objects, we are not caring about objects. We are not producing care practices on objects. We are caring with those objects and the people. And this idea of caring with, very similar to what some feminist theorists call thinking with, implies a flat ontology. What I mean by this is that there are no hierarchies of who knows more about what, because it assumes that we are all engaging in a practice of care equally. or as much as we can according to our possibilities. And this idea of caring with is, again, based on the idea of friendship and vulnerability. And I know it might seem odd to think about friendship with objects, but actually, I would say, when you relate to an object for enough time, you know it so well that you get to a point that it changes you in ways that you cannot really put into words. At least with me that happens. Conservation, as a dear friend, Renata Peter, says, is the act of transforming something, of course, but also being transformed by it. But it's also a form of trust and radical solidarity, which means accepting failure as part of the process of experimenting and allowing for time that, for reflection, as we've discussed yesterday, and time to devise these artworks and these objects through their many possibilities. So, is the idea of conservation and care a winter wonderland or an infernal winter? What do we want when we talk about conservation and care? Because indeed, if we associate conservation with a care practice, with it comes a lot of issues as well. Let's just be honest. It implies, for example, that the emotional labor that is involved in care activities, and that I would argue it's also involved in conservation many times, becomes part of the center stage of what conservation is. And we see that a lot when we work in conservation with various communities. But it also implies that if we are the only profession in the whole art ecosystem to do so, all that emotional labor will fall on us and not on anyone else. And that will create the absence of a parity and the absence of this solidarity that I'm talking about. So, of course, I believe that what I'm talking right now, it's an utopia in some ways, but it also can be aspirational, hopefully. But I'm going to give you an example. And the example is forensic architecture again. So in the exhibition Cloud Atlas, the Cloud Studies exhibition, Cloud Atlas, it's a movie, sorry about that. Science fiction, it's always in my head. Clearly, because I'm thinking that conservation could be solidarity, so we were talking always about science fiction. And this exhibition, what it shows is this engagement between all these different injustices and real event injustices and practices through a form of visuality that actually brings to the fore how they are related and promotes ways in which we can help, we can participate in this effort of solidarity. So this is an artistic practice that indeed engages in that form of caring with. However, when we also talk about conservation, many times we think, who is called to decide on what is solidarity, what is the artwork, and whose history gets written, who are the players that are part of that conservation history. And in the case of conservation of moving image, time-based media, things that have screens, that have equipment, that have software, machine learning, AI, you name it, film, tape. We've seen so many different medium formats during these days. It's also about which is the practice that becomes obsolete. Because as René van der Waal says, in a text that I love, she wrote it in 1999, and I think it's still very relevant. She says that conservation is all about tragic choices, because when you are preserving one set of values, you need to bury other set of values. There is no scenario, usually, where you can preserve everything forever. You always have to make these tragic choices. And what she says that I think, of course, this is beautiful, but what I think it's the most beautiful is that she says the problem is not when you make the choice and you lose some values and you enhance others. The problem is that when you pretend it doesn't hurt And it does hurt, and we all know that. But when we need to decide which are the practices that become obsolete, or how can we find ways to bring these practices back to memory, and we're talking about embodied memory, or not necessarily, we could talk about written memory, then this idea of conservation as care becomes, I think, quite generative, because it allows you to think with these objects and to have some sense of recognition of their vulnerability and the vulnerability of your own practice in many ways. That was, for example, when we were doing the conservation of this work, and I worked specifically with Meli Castro, trying to see how can we recuperate, how can we bring back this notion of censorship, because, you know, negative music was an artwork that was created to make visible the silence of the newly applied censorship practices in Portugal in the 1960s. And so by doing this action that was supposed to make a lot of noise and actually remained silent, it was just making that silence very visible, very sharp. And so before he passed away, I had the opportunity to speak with him and ask him, but how can we make that visible? Because that is what is important. And at the time, you know, I was really worried because some of the younger generations in Portugal were saying some things about the dictatorship, were saying, oh, come on, it wasn't that bad, and things of that sort. And I was like, but how can we make that visible again, make visible how bad it was, to a point where artists many times had to resort to these forms of concealing language so that they wouldn't be prosecuted. And he said something that is amazing. He said, you can always find ways to bring that back. And he was very optimistic. And then, of course, when I saw in 2017, there was an exhibition with a reenactment of this work, and it was amazing. And everyone that was there, even some people who didn't fully understand the context of this work, became emotional. And I thought, no, wait, things will be all right, we'll get there. And how it really brought to my attention, how can we find ways to sharpen those memories that sometimes are not necessarily concealed, but become numb or dormant? How can we activate them? And so that leads us to participation. Participation can mean many things, and usually the way that I see it, because again, I'm brought up in this feminist epistemology, is a mixture of communication. Communication, it's not the same as participation. Collaboration, it's not the same. Inclusiveness, it's not the same. Participation in this context means to engage people in deliberative practice as peers. And this is, I'm paraphrasing Nancy Fraser. Now, engaging people in deliberative practice is hard enough, right? Anyone here has ever worked with communities, for example, and I know that community as a term, it's quite contentious, but let's just use it for the sake of argument. Everyone here who has worked with communities knows that there is a difference between consultation and then having those communities with a seat at the table making decisions with the museum. It's quite different. And many times, even after efforts of consultation, decision-making does not result in a participative effort. Decision-making many times has other values that are not the ones that are brought to the table by efforts of consultation. So Nancy Fraser in 1990 says that participation, parity of participation, consists of creating opportunities for everyone to participate as peers. That doesn't mean to participate equally. That means to participate as peers because everyone participates to the extent of their possibilities. And that's not the same as participating equally. So let's talk about the project we've done at Tate. And before I go on, I would like to say that I did not do this alone. This was a collaborative project that involved more than 20 people. And I would like to make that very clear, because one of the things that is important in politics of participation is that of recognition. We worked with many people, and this was an effort that involved everyone from art handlers, registrars, the research team, the project team, the conservation team, these people that I will introduce in a second, artists, collaborators, and even publics. So this was a participative effort, and I'm going to say why. So you remember that artwork that I started when I started working at Tate, 10 Years Alive on the Infinite Plane. As I said, that is an artwork that involves experimental music. Tony Conrad was an amazing violinist, mathematician, a father, a teacher, a cinematographer, filmmaker, and a musician. So yes, I do feel quite disappointed with my life when I look at Tony Conrad, because he was a man of many identities that felt very comfortable within all of them, which is amazing. So he created this artwork, 10 Years Alive, as a reflection of 10 years thinking about the drone sound. And of course, this has some iterations before, namely with Lamont Young. We can go back to Stockhausen, John Cage, and all of those were very influential in the context of experimental music in New York and Buffalo in the 60s. And so by creating this drone sound, at the same time, he was also exploring with film as materiality. And I'm talking about the flickering effect, the idea of stripes, the idea of light, the idea of contrast in experimental film. And so he created this performance, that it's a 90-minute performance. And when we first realized, when we first started this research at Tate, we realized there were 13 different iterations of this work until up to 2017, from 1972 to 2017. And none of them was the same. And in every of them, the artist did not give any instructions because he always participated actively in the artwork. But at the time, the artwork was an acquisition candidate, and we're like, okay, so how are we going to produce this artwork and activate it when the artist is no longer alive and cannot participate in the artwork he created? So the idea that we've developed collaboratively is to create a documentation based on our museum documentation, a bit more than that actually, and give it to 3 musicians who never played the artwork before and never seen the artwork before, and also a projectionist. And although he had seen the work before, he never had played it. And so these are the 3 musicians that were reading our documentation. Spoiler alert, they found it very confusing. We had a lot of mistakes, and because none of us is a musician, we also did a lot of things that apparently are absurd and very contradicting. But that's normal, because the way that we gathered the information to make this document was by interviewing everyone that we could get a hand on that participated in the 13 iterations before. So we've done more than 40 different interviews, just talking to people saying, what do you remember about this work? What do you remember feeling in regard to how you were doing it? So the interviews were very much based on memory studies scholarship, so we were interested in how they remembered the work and not necessarily what the work was, because limits are quite blurry there. We're talking about some people had performed the work almost 50 years before. So what was the work for them? It's no more than a memory, and that's fine, because these artworks also survive as memories, right? So one of the groups said, I'm pretty sure that the violin was in a C sharp. And we're like, good, 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 C sharp. Others would say, no, no, it was a D, it was a D. And we're like, great, it's a D. And apparently that's quite different. I mean, we knew it was quite different, but we didn't know that it would impact the whole performance, that we realized afterwards. So this new generation of performers were to read this, perform the artwork after 2 days of rehearsals, and to perform it to older generation of performers, which we call the transmitters. And the transmitters would hear it and then comment, giving to the new generation of performers their own experiences of performing the work and saying what the work was in their perspective. And we were there like a little flies, just looking at the interaction and how they explore this work together. So during the rehearsals, for example, the projectionist said that when during the first rehearsal, for example, he just started to invent and to try to play with the projectors because each projector is different and they are all the same Aki projectors, 16 mils, but there are things that you only realize after you understand the mechanics of that specific equipment. And so he wanted to try these different types of projections, while the new generation musician that played the long string instrument, which is that instrument that you see over there, that Tony Conrad created. It's an instrument made out of just 2 chords. And so he looked with a lot of attention to the instructions that we provided, which was a video of one person who had performed the work before. And so he was also trying with the instrument, and he was really having an embodied experience while experimenting with the instrument. And that was during the dress rehearsal. So they all thought that the dress rehearsal was an essential point of their interaction with the objects, and that the objects were also part and were also participating in that performance. So then we interviewed them, and then we interviewed, a lot of interviews, a lot of data. Now the digital preservation of that data is going to be funny and interesting, but I'm not at Tate anymore, so it's not my responsibility, so it's good. We interviewed them multiple times, trying to understand how they are understanding the documentation we produced, but also how the performance went. And so, after the first dress rehearsal, everyone was joining a circle, and the first question that Pip Lorentzen, who was the PI of this project, asked was this 10 Years Alive on the Infinite Plane? And one of the curators of an iteration in 2007 in Brussels said, this is not his exact quote, by the way, but he said something in the lines of, yeah, it was, but at the same time it wasn't, which is really interesting. Because here we see how the identities of the work are mutable, right? Yes, this was the work, but at the same time, in my view, it wasn't really the work. So we spent 3.5 hours trying to understand what the work was for that set of people, for that community of practitioners, and also trying to see what was the practice, what was the gap in practice between the older generation of musicians and projectionists and the new generation of musicians and projectionists. And so they then had an exchange where the idea of embodied knowledge, of that tacitability of the gesture, of the feeling, was transmitted. And so they had another performance, and this time it was a public performance. And so the idea is that they were able to then show a new performance that was just slightly different, but for many of them was exactly the artwork. And so among the many things that we've we've decided is that this work cannot be shown without the figure of the transmitter. So every time the artwork now goes to another venue, someone from from an old generation of transmitters, of which the people who are new generations here are now, those people are going to be part of the biography of the work in many ways, because they are now going to be part of each new activation. And at the same time, the other thing that we did is we assumed that the documentation produced for this work was a collaborative and participative effort. And so, under the idea of reciprocity, it is going to be made public so that many people can use it and can also add to it. So, in conclusion, in this very, I know this was very sinuous presentation, which is a euphemism, a very good way of saying that I touched on many topics, but let's then wrap up and make those topics wrapped up together. So can we talk about participation and care and conservation, question mark? Because if you remember, my title of the presentation was Participation and Care, no question mark. My question here is, can conservation engage with practices of participation and care? And I think yes, but with some specific conditions. So, for example, one of the things that we see is that the time of the museum is not the same as the time of the artwork, and this is something that we touched on in yesterday's roundtable, because for many of these works, we need a slow process of conservation. So, for example, my work with this work by Tony Conrad lasted 2 years. And it was funded by, again, an externally funded project where this was one of my sole concerns, at least half of the week. At least half of the week I was working on the project solely. And so I had that time and space to talk about and think about that. The other half of the week I was working with the time-based media team in acquisitions specifically. And the pace was much faster, and it was really hard sometimes to focus, to have this in-depth study of these works. And I think indeed that slow conservation is needed to make processes more inclusive and fair. And also, for example, to gather this amount of information about an artwork, you need time, and you also need practices of reciprocity, and to understand that if you are taking someone else's time and use it in your institution's behalf, you need to be able to then reciprocate in one way or the other. And also, you need to be able to say, I honestly don't know. I have no idea what to do with this work, because then you can gather a team that can help you with that. And care is also about that. Caring with an artwork is assuming, it's being able to see and to assume from the ground up that you are vulnerable and your team, it might not be enough. And that's fine, because many of these practices, like we see in Tony Conrad, they exist outside of the museum. And these communities of practice need to be fostered outside of the museum. The museum is not an autonomous beast. It is an institution that is part of a bigger ecosystem. And indeed, care can be oppressive when it promotes forms of control. And sometimes we care for artworks in a way that is controlling them and stopping their growth. But it can also be a way to consider an artwork and how it lives in these social worlds, and how it can participate in the making of social worlds and activating these social worlds. And finally, I think conservationist care means to yield control and to promote this practice that goes beyond accepted certainties, but not just accepted certainties as conservators, but of the institution itself. And that's it. I would like to acknowledge everyone that is within this, but everyone else as well. I like to acknowledge everyone in general. And thank you.